All right, guys, so we're going to go over volume landmarks, and how to conceptualize the idea of volume and training intensity. And specifically, this is going to be for muscle hypertrophy in the beginning, then we'll talk about strength after that. But we want to think that volume landmarks, which have been made very popular by Mike Israetel and Renaissance periodization, they have minimum effective volume, maximum adaptive volume, and maximum recoverable volume. And their train of thought, their idea is we should start every mesocycle, every block off with minimum effective volume so we can get the most out of the least, and then we're going to progress our way. So this may be week 1, and then up here is going to be week 3 to 4. And then down here, as we get to the maximum recoverable volume, that's going to be weeks 5 and 6. And that's kind of conceptualized theory approach of volume landmarks and wave progressions up. So we start with the minimum amount of volume, and then we'll go to the maximum recoverable volume. But in my opinion, right, when we have this maximum adaptive volume, like this sweet spot of like, this is where the best progress is. We get some progress here, but not a lot, or not as much as we can get. We can get optimal progress here, and then here we can get a shit ton of progress, but the higher risk of injury occurs here, right? As we accumulate more fatigue, our risk of injury becomes higher and higher. So why not just stay here in that sweet spot the entire time, and then just undulate intensity and continue to focus on overload progression and principles to maintain this maximum adaptive volume. So when you think about that, minimum effective volume is going to be anywhere from 6 to 10 sets, and then maximum is going to be 10 to 18, and then maximum adaptive 10 to 18, and then maximum recoverable is going to be in that higher 18 to 22 sets. Even some research has shown 30 to 40 sets, but it's mostly in untrained people. And understand, most of this research, when it does talk about volume and hypertrophy, is in untrained subjects. So that's a very big confounding principle when you're talking about, should I apply this over to my own training? And then understanding the paradigm of intensity and volume and how that correlates, right? So the higher intensity, meaning that the higher we can get closer, the closer to failure we go, the less reps in reserve, right? So we're thinking about reps in reserve of 0 to 1, the less volume we're going to be able to accumulate. So if we're in these higher volume sets, we're not going to necessarily be able to train closer to failure. And if we're in these lower volume sets, we must train closer to failure in order for us to actually get that adaptation, that stimulus that we want. So as volume increases, right, your training to failure is going to start to decrease. Your load's going to start to decrease as well. Your maximum load is going to decrease. So when we're thinking about what makes the person as big as possible, what drives muscle hypertrophy, the mechanisms of action are going to be mechanical tension, which is the load on the bar, the amount of force that we can produce, and then it's going to be metabolite buildup and possibly muscle damage, and that's going to be in those higher rep ranges. So understanding that if we're in this 10 to 18 rep range, some of these sets are going to be focused on mechanical tension, which is going to be anywhere from 5 to, I would say, 12 reps of just getting really strong within that rep range. And then when we start thinking about metabolite buildups and trying to get that other end of the spectrum, maybe more of the sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, whereas in the mechanical tension, we're thinking about more of the myofibrillar hypertrophy. We're going to be going into those 12 to 30 rep ranges, because if you look at the research, we're thinking about what's going to be the drive-in rep ranges that drive hypertrophy the most, and that's going to be anywhere from 6 to 30 reps with the loads undulating within that. So within this maximum adaptable volume, this is the one we want to focus on, that 10 to 18 sets. If we're having someone that's really, really strong, right, they're going to be closer to that 10 set, because strength also increases intensity as well. So if we have someone that squats 600 pounds and they're training closer to failure, that's going to be an inability to get to that 18 set mark if we have someone that's squatting half that weight, even training to the same amount of failure. So where their strength levels are is also going to dictate where that rep range is as well, right? So intensity is going to be load on the bar and how close you are to failure when you're thinking about trying to shift those paradigms within this set dynamic. So volume within these 10 to 18 sets, anywhere from 6 to 30 reps, and frequency anywhere between 2 to 3 times a week per frequency, depending on how strong you are. If you're very, very strong, you may only have to train the frequency once, but if you look at the research, we're thinking about 2 times a week in order for us to train and continue to get that muscle protein turnover, that muscle protein synthesis. Every time we train, right, our body starts to break down and it starts to create muscle protein synthesis. So the more often we train, the more often we're building up muscle. So maintaining within this rep range, because if we start here at the smaller rep range with the heavier stuff and then we go to the maximum volume, right, that paradigm shift of 6 to 10 sets to 18 to 22 sets creates such a magnitude of fatigue that you're going to be in a higher risk of injury theoretically, right? None of this has actually been proven within the research, but if we can just maintain our working sets here in this adaptive volume, that's going to be the best bang for our buck. That should be where we should focus most of our stuff going into it. So maybe starting the block off with 10 sets, and then by the end of the block, working your way up to maybe 18 sets is going to be something that's going to be a little bit more simplistic for that athlete, and it's going to lend itself to less fatigue accumulation over the entire block. And if we can stay there and just manipulate back and forth, we're going to need less room for deloads, less room for the need to recover as much to reduce fatigue. So that's what I think about when thinking about muscle hypertrophy. Volume is going to be sets, frequency, and intensity, and volume, and all those things kind of correlate together. As intensity and load goes up, right, training closer to failure, volume goes down. And if you don't want to do that, because we've seen in the research, reps and reserves of anywhere from 3 to 5 allows you to still have hypertrophic gains, then you're going to have to do more work. You have to do more sets. So my preference is let's get the most we can and train closer to failure and train with as much load as we can and just progressively overload that within this minimum effective range here of 10 to 18 where we get the most adaptable volume.
Awesome. Now, just one question. In terms of hypertrophy in general, and this is kind of touching on that, different body parts. There's obviously different types of training styles, like bro splits, this, that, and the other thing. When it comes to the type of muscle or the location of the muscle, whether it's like a quad or a hamstring, do you have different sort of variations between how you train bigger muscles versus smaller muscles or anything like that?
Yeah, so when you're thinking about that type of stuff, exercise selection, you're thinking about stimulus to fatigue ratio, right? Every exercise requires a certain amount of fatigue that delivers a certain amount of stimulus. So if my idea is I want to drive as much quad hypertrophy as possible, a squat is going to give me pretty good stimulus, but it's going to give me a ton of fatigue. Whereas if I do a hack squat, that's going to give me far more stimulus to my quads and far less fatigue. So I'm going to be able to train that a little bit more frequently, a little bit more often. When it comes to deciding on frequency per body part, right? The more frequently we can train a weak body part, the more it's going to grow, the more stimulus it's going to get. So it doesn't really matter the size of the body part, it matters more the weakness. If you look at the research, anywhere between 2 to 3 times a week frequency for any of the lifts is primary where you want to be in terms of that sweet spot of muscle protein synthesis being turned on again and again. So yeah, you want to think about what exercise is going to drive the most fatigue and what's going to give you the most stimulus. And from a pure hypertrophy standpoint, we want stimulus to be as high as possible and fatigue to be as low as we can, right? So maybe squats aren't going to be the best exercise to grow your legs. Maybe a hack squat or a leg press is going to be, because the fatigue's not going to be as high, but the stimulus is going to be through the roof. And that's going to allow us to train more frequently and more often.